Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today in this important and extremely timely discussion about a very critical issue, one that I've worked on for quite some time throughout my career. And it is really amazing to see the interfaith cooperation that is emerging around the situation in Xinjiang, as well as the efforts going on across faith communities to try to promote action and to actually move beyond just condemnation, as some of the other speakers have said. I really want to especially thank Magen Avot for inviting me to participate. And I was especially moved this morning, or it was morning here when it happened on the East Coast in the United States, when one of the first panelists spoke about the story of Moses at the well in Midian, and how Moses took a great risk to assist female shepherdesses at the well and to help them when they were being mistreated and discriminated against at the well. And it set the right tone for this wonderful conference today. And I think that that's a great segue into some of the things that I'd like to talk about how, as policymakers, as citizens in free societies, as investors in free societies, and just as human beings, we can help to address some of the challenges. And I know, as the Right Honorable Ian Duncan Smith was saying, it can be overwhelming to look at China, which is so powerful and is becoming more and more aggressive and powerful each day, it seems like, and growing economically, and think it's hopeless to try to do anything about the situation. But I don't believe that. I believe that there are things that we can do, and I believe that there are sensitivities that the Chinese Communist Party has that we can exploit. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those things. I was intrigued to hear one of the other speakers speak about the concept of how hurting others not only harms others, but it harms oneself when you do that. There's a similar concept in Buddhism. And this is, and I think that we all have seen through our own societies how discrimination, violence, and dehumanization have created costs and consequences, not just for the direct victims and survivors of these acts, but for the societies themselves and for the majority communities that perpetrate those acts. And no society is able to escape those consequences, regardless of their political system. I think that China believes that they can, and that the Chinese Communist Party believes that they can carry out the kinds of atrocities and abuses that they are carrying out, and that they will not face the consequences of those acts. But I am convinced that no society can escape those consequences, and that they ultimately will have to deal with and have a reckoning with those things. I also do believe that we do need to acknowledge the challenges of dealing with China as an abuser here. They are not 10 feet tall, and they do have certain vulnerabilities that we can exploit. In particular, Xi Jinping himself craves legitimacy. He wants to be seen as a world leader. He wants China to be viewed as a great power. He wants to be able to portray China as a great power. And so one of the things that when I was in the U.S. government, and especially when we were at the UN, that we focused on with our own rhetoric was, how do we exploit that insecurity that really lies at some of the behavior internationally that we see from the Chinese Communist Party, some of the aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy that's really rooted in a sense of insecurity, grievance, and victimhood that the Chinese Communist Party perpetuates and fosters in order to be able to lash out and act in this aggrieved and aggressive way. So I think that we have seen that the actions to date, while insufficient, have provoked a response from the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that we need to very clearly look at what we have done so far in terms of sanctions, in terms of condemnation, international multilateral coordinated action, and try to determine what has been most effective, what has the greatest impact, and how we can lean into some of those things that have been able to have a more profound impact. For that, I wanted to focus on a few things. I tend to think of this in terms of the long-term goal, obviously, is to change the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party and to end the repression of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim minorities, as well as other persecuted peoples in the People's Republic of China. But in the short term, we need to focus on how we can raise the costs of those behaviors to the Chinese Communist Party and ensure that they are not able to just do these things without any consequences or any costs attached to them. So I think that diplomatically, that means that we continue to push in these multilateral spaces, in these multilateral forums, and keep building out the coalition of international voices speaking on this issue, especially in the developing world, where right now the condemnation is largely centered in the Western countries and among the developed countries. But we need to really reach out beyond our comfort zone and get developing countries involved in these conversations too. We can talk to these countries about how the forced labor schemes in Xinjiang, for instance, just serve as a subsidy for Chinese products that then disadvantages other countries that are developing and trying to break into different places on the value chain, for instance. Even if you're not able to make a moral or human rights argument with them, you can make an economic argument with them. I think also we need to really work harder at getting the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Muslim majority countries to join in and raise their voices about this. China has been able to use their silence very strategically to block criticism and as a seal of approval for their policies and actions in Xinjiang. And we need to really get them to think about at least stop providing cover for the Chinese if they're not ready to speak out directly. And then we need to look beyond the Human Rights Council and the kind of obvious places in the UN at things like the General Assembly, at the women's organizations, the Commission on the Status of Women, other instances where the UN is focusing on gender, on climate, on development. All of these issues have a very strong nexus with Xinjiang, whether it's the Belt and Road and development in Xinjiang, or it's women and Xinjiang and forced sterilization and coercive population control, and the fact that UN agencies are still present in China, working with the same Chinese state apparatus organizations that are carrying out these policies in Xinjiang. All of these things are points that we need to be very vigorously raising across a wide range of multilateral forum, because China really has invested a lot in trying to build up its presence and its image in these forums. They invest a lot, and it's very important to them that when they get criticized, they respond very viscerally. Bilaterally, I think we need to continue to work on the sanctions. They have had an effect, especially the targeting of industries that are impacted by forced labor and implicated in other abuses. Once the sanctions are in place, it's really important that we make sure our governments are vigorously enforcing them and really working to ensure that they are taking those enforcement actions not only against Chinese companies, but also against our domestic industries to ensure that they have what they need to know to avoid the companies that are sanctioned and the industries that are sanctioned, as well as and helping to build alternatives. And that brings me to what we as individuals can do. And I think that, and you've heard from others about how important it is to use your democratic voice and reach out to your parliamentarians. That's obviously very critical, but there are other things that we can do. And the first, and in some ways, both the simplest and the hardest thing we can do is as consumers to make sure that when we are buying products that we do check labels, make sure that we, to the extent possible, are not purchasing products made in China. It's something that I've become it's hard. I know, because I try to do it myself. And so I know that there are times where you literally cannot find an alternative. So in those instances, I will very grudgingly purchase what I need to do. But I will go to the shopkeeper, I will go to the seller, and I will say, look, I really try to avoid purchasing products made in China for these reasons. And I would really prefer to have an alternative. I'm purchasing this, but it's I would like you to try to think about stocking alternatives. And I find that it opens up a really interesting conversation with some of these retailers. I think we also need to make sure that companies like Amazon and others are very clearly labeling products, and that we are holding them to account on country of origin labels so that we can be informed and active consumers. I think it does take a little bit of work. I'm not going to lie about that. And it can be a little bit more expensive sometimes. But I found that you often end up with a superior product. I do a lot of buying things that are used now. I even the other day bought used hooks because I couldn't find clothing hooks that were made in anywhere but China. So I went to a salvage place and found used ones. I mean, you can do it. It does require some work. And it's maybe not for everyone, but I think it is something that we should think about. The other thing we need to do is use our voices online. There are still Americans and British citizens that are working as propaganda shills for the Chinese Communist Party. They appear on YouTube and they're able to monetize their accounts on YouTube because the Chinese Communist Party engages in what's called bot fraud and uses click farms to drive traffic to these videos that otherwise nobody would give any mind to. But it's a backdoor way of paying these people to propagandize on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And they almost exclusively, or at least primarily, do this on the issue of Xinjiang. We need to alert platforms like YouTube to these things, make sure they are correctly labeling, and when possible, demonetizing accounts that are engaging in genocide denial and also acting as agents of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Party state. So this is something that we can all do, again, just when we're online. Then the final thing that I would encourage people to do, one of the things that's most important to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese economy is access to capital markets in the United States, the UK, and the EU. And these liquid convertible capital markets are critical to China's continued economic growth, which is in turn essential to the Chinese Communist Party's continued legitimacy and its ability to rule the Chinese people. We as investors need to be very mindful that our large index funds like Vanguard, and I'm not sure what the UK equivalents are to these things, but they invest a lot in Chinese government bonds. I've spoken with my investment advisor about making sure that we, to the extent possible, are not invested in products and in index funds that engage in these kinds of purchases. I think you're seeing our Wall Street, I can't say about the city, but I know in the United States, there is a growing awareness of the risks, certainly after the IPO that was such a problem last week with the ride-hailing app in China, Didi. And so we're trying to push this really to get to both make sure that as an investor, as a stakeholder, a shareholder in companies, that they are engaging in responsible practices, and that we're using our voice as shareholders to try to educate and to pressure companies, because they are susceptible to shareholder action. We've seen this on climate, and we're looking very closely at how the climate action and anti-racism action here in the United States to mobilize proxy votes and things like this have impacted companies, and what lessons we can learn about doing that from a human rights standpoint. Because it's not enough for companies to say, oh, we're following environmental, social, and governance standards, and we're a good corporate citizen, if they're then turning around and importing products that they can't certify are not made with forced labor, or that they're working with entities in China that are implicated in abuses against Xinjiang. So those are some of the things that I'm working on, and I am trying to do both myself and encouraging my family, friends, and people I know to really do this, because it does take all of us. And it can be very disempowering to look at China and how powerful they are and think, there's nothing I can do, but there are things that you can do. And as a former government official, there were things I could do in that space. And then as a private citizen, I continue to try to find those ways that I can. With that, I'm going to turn it back to our host. Thank you.